The first strange thing I noticed that evening was my boss actually laughing. Not that polite, practiced smile she flashed at clients or the guarded expression she wore during high-stakes meetings, but a real, effortless laugh. Her head tipped back just a bit, one hand coming up to cover her mouth, while the warm, golden lights of the hotel bar danced in her usually cool eyes. For a split second, Vivien Hayes looked like someone who had finally set down the crushing weight of having to be the strongest person in the room. That probably should have been my first clue. For 14 months, Vivien had been my supervisor at one of Chicago's premier boutique branding agencies. I was a senior copywriter. She was our creative director. The kind of woman who could rescue a tanking presentation, silence demanding clients with a few serene sentences, and somehow track every team member's coffee order despite managing million-dollar accounts. She intimidated most people not out of cruelty, but because she seemed completely unshakable. Yet underneath that polished exterior beat a genuinely kind heart. She'd stay late to tutor junior designers, quietly dispatch meals to coworkers dealing with family crises. And when my father underwent emergency heart surgery, she approved my leave in seconds before having flowers sent to the hospital from the company. She never brought it up again. That quiet grace was precisely why I admired her far more than was safe. Crossing professional lines with your boss was a recipe for disaster. So I buried those feelings deep down, convincing myself they'd stay locked away forever. That night was supposed to be a standard victory lap. After 6 grueling weeks of endless revisions, sleep-deprived nights, and impossible client demands, our team had finally locked down a massive luxury hotel branding contract. We gathered in the lounge to celebrate. By 10:30 p.m., half the crew had cleared out. By 11 o'clock, only 4 of us were left, and by 11:40 it was just Vivien and me. I should have headed home, too, but instead she lifted her martini, flashed a teasing smile across the table and said, "You're free to go, Owen. I promise I won't dock your attendance points." I laughed. I could never forgive myself for abandoning my creative director. She smiled knowingly. "See? Work has completely institutionalized you." For the next 20 minutes, we talked about everything except deadlines and deliverables. It was wonderfully disorienting to see the flesh and blood woman behind the corporate armor. She kicked off her high heels under the table and let out a long, shuddering sigh. "You know what I loathe most about big wins?" she asked. "What? That everyone expects you to throw a party." I guessed. She nodded, a wry smile touching her lips. "The truth is, after projects like this, I usually just want to crawl into bed." I looked across at her, grinning. "Careful, you're starting to sound dangerously human." She laughed softly. "If the office caught wind of that, my entire authority would evaporate by morning." Right on cue, her phone buzzed against the wood. She glanced at the screen, and the shift was instantaneous. Most people wouldn't have caught it, but after a year of sitting across from her, I knew the micro-expressions. The warmth vanished, her shoulders squared into rigid lines, and she quietly flipped the device face down. "You okay?" I asked. "I'm fine." "You definitely don't look fine." She studied me for a long beat. "Is this genuine concern? Or are you just recycling crisis management tactics from the branding floor?" I smiled. "Probably a bit of both." She stayed silent for a long moment before letting out a quiet confession. "My ex-fiancé just got engaged." The words hung heavy in the air. "I'm so sorry," I murmured. She gave a light, defensive shrug. "We split up nearly 2 years ago. I just didn't expect to find out via social media." I couldn't help a small smile. She caught it instantly. "What?" "Nothing. It's just... that's probably the most painfully relatable thing you've ever said." She let out a soft laugh, and the bartender, apparently sensing she'd hit her limit, quietly slid a glass of ice water in front of her instead of another martini. She accepted it without a word of protest. Around midnight, the lounge lights flickered as the staff prepared to close. I stood up, offering a hand. "Come on, let's get you home safe." Vivien stood up with practiced confidence, only to wobble on her very first step. She grabbed my arm to steady herself, letting out an embarrassed sigh. "Guess I'm not quite as graceful as I thought." Outside, Chicago welcomed us with a biting winter gale. Every cab was packed, and rideshare surge pricing had quadrupled thanks to a just-ended concert nearby. Vivien leaned against a stone pillar, still clutching her expensive heels in one hand. "Should I call your sister?" I asked. She cracked one eye open. "My sister has 3 kids under 6, so absolutely not. If I wake her up because I had a drink too much, she'll probably leave me out here on the curb as a life lesson." I chuckled. "Fair point. All right, let's get you to a train." She shook her head immediately. "My landlord already knows way too much about my life. I'd rather not hand him fresh material." I studied her closely. The immaculate executive who always seemed entirely bulletproof now looked like a woman who just wanted the universe to stop making demands of her for a single night. My apartment was a 6-minute walk away. Hers was a grueling half-hour trek through downtown traffic. After turning it over in my mind, I spoke up carefully. "My place is just around the corner. You can crash on the couch, drink some water, and head out first thing tomorrow before anyone's even awake." She didn't answer right away. Instead, she searched my face with surprising intensity. "Are you someone I can actually lower my guard around?" The question threw me, but I didn't hesitate. "Yes." She weighed my answer for a few more seconds before giving a slow nod. "Okay." That was how I found myself walking through the midnight chill with my boss leaning lightly against my shoulder, carrying her designer heels in one hand, while I quietly realized that life was never going to go back to normal. When I unlocked my front door a few minutes later, I saw my apartment through Vivien's eyes for the very first time. Compared to the sleek minimalism she was used to, my place was delightfully ordinary. A battered blue sofa sat beneath a crooked landscape painting I'd never gotten around to fixing. Books spilled across the coffee table. A few hardy houseplants crowded the windowsill, and a standing lamp cast a cozy amber glow over everything. It wasn't messy, but it unmistakably belonged to a guy who prioritized ideas over interior design. Vivien stepped inside barefoot, taking a slow tour of the room with a soft smile. "You actually keep plants?" she asked, genuinely surprised. "I'm just as shocked they're still breathing," I admitted. She chuckled softly. "You sound entirely too proud of yourself." "I am." For the first time all evening, she looked completely at ease. She shed her blazer, draped it over a chair, and took the glass of warm water I handed her. Then polished off a second one without a single complaint while leaning against the kitchen counter. "Feeling human again?" I asked. She considered it. "Better than 10 minutes ago. Not quite 100%. Honesty looks good on you. Alcohol lowers the defenses," she replied with a faint, tired smile. I grabbed a spare blanket and tossed it over the sofa. "You can take the couch. I'll grab the armchair." She looked from the narrow cushions back to me. "That doesn't look very comfortable." "Neither is sleeping on the hardwood, but I'll manage." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "You're absurdly prepared for random crises. Working under you leaves a mark." That earned another genuine laugh. Rummaging through my drawers, I found the cleanest gray t-shirt I owned and handed it over. "If you want something a bit softer." She took it, our fingers brushing for a brief second. "Thank you, Owen." While she changed in the bathroom, I set fresh water by the couch, dimmed the lights, and reminded myself sternly that this was just an act of basic human decency. Nothing more, nothing less. Then she walked back out wearing my oversized tee. Her hair was completely down for the first time since I'd known her, falling in soft waves past her shoulders. Stripped of the tailored power suit, the exhaustion-masked makeup, and the rigid posture, she looked entirely different. Less like the intimidating creative director everyone revered, and more like a regular woman who had simply run out of steam at the end of a very long road. I realized I was staring. She caught me immediately. What? I cleared my throat quickly, just wondering why my old college shirt suddenly looks like haute couture. The corner of her mouth ticked up. Good save. She settled onto the couch, kicked back, and closed her eyes. For several quiet minutes, neither of us spoke. I actually thought she'd drifted off until her voice broke the silence. Are you just going to sit over there all night? My heart did a sharp little gymnastics routine. I sat down in the armchair across from her. She cracked one eye open. That's not what I meant. I glanced at the narrow strip of empty space beside her on the couch. This sofa isn't exactly built for good judgment. She flashed a mischievous smile and scooted over. There's plenty of room. I carefully perched on the absolute edge, maintaining as much buffer zone as physics allowed. She looked at me and burst out laughing. You're sitting like human resources is hiding behind the curtains. In my head, I thought they practically are. She shook her head. Least romantic sentence ever uttered. I met her gaze calmly. I'm not trying to be romantic. The words settled heavily between us. She studied my face in the dim light before whispering, I know. After another long stretch of quiet, she let out a sigh. I owe you an apology. For what? For crashing in your apartment wearing your clothes because my ex got engaged, and handling the whole thing like an emotional train wreck. I offered a soft smile. You're being way too hard on yourself. She looked away. Maybe. I leaned forward slightly. You've spent weeks under brutal pressure. Tonight you got broadside by garbage news. You're exhausted, mortified, and drained. You're allowed to have one night where you don't have to hold it all together. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked at me with an expression I had never seen on her face before. Pure vulnerability. You always do that, she murmured. Do what? You make the heavy things feel light. I smiled. Maybe because they aren't as insurmountable as they look from the inside. Her eyes locked onto mine. You're a dangerous man, Owen. Truly. Kind men are always dangerous. I let out a low laugh. Life is terribly unfair. A few minutes later, her breathing evened out. She wasn't fully asleep yet, just drifting toward the edge. Without opening her eyes, she whispered, Will you stay right here until I'm actually out? The question echoed what she'd asked outside the hotel, whether I was someone she could trust. Always, I answered softly. I stayed put. Sometime during the early hours of the morning, exhaustion finally claimed me too. I don't remember moving, just the steady rhythm of rain tapping against the glass and the quiet warmth of the room before sleep pulled me under. When I blinked awake the next morning, pale winter sunlight was slicing through the gap in the curtains. For a confused second, I couldn't figure out why I felt so warm. Then I looked down. Vivien was curled up against my chest, one arm loosely draped across my waist beneath the blanket. Sometime in the dead of night, we'd both slid across the narrow sofa without waking up. I froze, terrified of disturbing her. A moment later, she stirred. Her body went completely rigid as awareness trickled back in. Slowly, carefully, she lifted her head and met my eyes. The usual executive poise was entirely absent, replaced by a deep, genuine flush of embarrassment. She whispered. I gave a careful, reassuring smile. Good morning. She sat up slowly, pressing fingers to her temples. I think I owe you another apology for using you as a living pillow. Only if I get to apologize for stealing half the blanket. She blinked, then let out a reluctant laugh. Fair enough. Honestly, I added, I think we both just accidentally passed out. She shook her head in disbelief. You have a terrifying talent for making awkward situations feel completely normal. I'm just trying to keep the panic to a minimum. Her expression softened. I haven't slept that peacefully beside someone in a very long time. The words carried infinitely more weight than any banter we'd tossed around the night before. I answered quietly, You were running on fumes. She looked at me for a long, searching moment. That wasn't the only reason. Neither of us said another word. We didn't need to. Something unspoken had been humming beneath the surface for months. And sitting together on that battered blue couch in the morning light, neither of us could pretend it wasn't there anymore. The silence was shattered by the sharp buzz of Vivien's phone on the coffee table. She glanced at the screen and groaned. Of course. Bad news. Client wants an emergency conference call in 40 minutes. They've decided to blow up the entire launch timeline overnight. I checked the clock. Rough way to start a Wednesday. She gave me a deadpan look. It's Thursday. I blinked. That's somehow worse. She laughed, and hearing that sound again instantly lifted the air in the room. It was a reminder that beneath the corporate chaos, she was still the brilliant, composed woman I respected so much. Only now I had seen the side of her she hid from the rest of the world. She stood up slowly, looking down at my oversized t-shirt. I should probably clear out before your neighbors start drafting conspiracy theories. At least wash your face first, I teased. You've got a boardroom to terrorize, remember? She hesitated, then nodded. While she disappeared into the bathroom, I fired up the coffee maker and rummaged through my closet for the cleanest white dress shirt I owned. A few minutes later, she emerged with damp hair, looking refreshed despite everything, still draped in my gray tee. Somehow, without the corporate armor, she looked even more striking. I handed her a mug of coffee and the folded shirt. This should fit under your blazer well enough. She took them with a grateful smile. You keep making mornings way easier than they have any right to be. Occupational hazard. Creative problem solving. She studied me intently before speaking in a much quieter tone. No, Owen. That's not what's getting me. Then what is? You're making it entirely too hard for me not to lean on your kindness. I didn't answer right away, because I knew exactly what she meant. A few minutes later, she stepped back out of the bedroom, fully transformed. The sharp blazer was back on, her hair twisted neatly into place. Within seconds, the formidable creative director had returned. Yet the air had shifted. Before slipping her heels back on, she turned to face me. I don't want last night to become one of those things we mutually pretend never happened. Her words caught me off guard because they were an exact echo of my own thoughts. I nodded immediately. Neither do I. She looked visibly relieved. Good. I walked her to the front door. As she stepped into her heels, she looked almost identical to the woman who walked into the agency every morning. Almost, because right before pulling the door open, she paused and looked back. I have to ask you something. Anything. She held my gaze without flinching. If I do something entirely reckless right now, are you going to chalk it up to too much tequila last night? Time seemed to stall. I weighed my words carefully. No. She waited. I would never do that. Something melted in her expression. She closed the distance between us until only inches remained, the morning light catching her face. Good, she whispered. Because if I decide to kiss you right now, I want you to know it has nothing to do with the whiskey. Every instinct in me screamed to close the gap, but I forced myself to slow down. She deserved clarity, not just impulse. I offered a gentle smile. If you kiss me, I'm definitely kissing you back. She smiled. I just need to know we're not confusing last night's wreckage with today's sunlight. She searched my face for a long moment. That's why I trust you. My heart thudded hard against my ribs. I've asked myself 100 times, she continued softly, whether you were just naturally kind, or if what's been building between us is real. I know the answer now. She took one more step closer. Do you? I didn't hesitate anymore. Yes. I met her eyes directly. I've cared about you for a lot longer than is strictly professional. I just never wanted to back you into an impossible corner. She listened without interrupting. You're my boss. People would tear your reputation apart. They'd question your authority. I never wanted our dynamic to become something either of us had to look back on with regret. A warm, radiant smile broke across her face. You really do spend all your time thinking about everyone else, don't you? I'm trying to think about us. Her eyes shimmered. That's exactly why She cut herself off, took a steadying breath, and reached up to lightly rest her palm against my cheek. Her skin was warm, steady, and utterly sure. Let me answer my own question, she whispered. I am completely sober. She rose onto her toes and kissed me. It wasn't rushed, frantic, or fueled by liquid courage. It was gentle, patient, and carried the weight of months of unvoiced feelings finally breaking out into the open. When we finally parted, neither of us spoke for a long beat. She rested her forehead lightly against mine and let out a soft laugh. Well, that's one way to shake up a Thursday morning. I smiled. Actually, I think we just simplified things. She laughed again, though her expression quickly turned serious. We still have to navigate reality. I nodded. The office. Exactly. Neither of us wanted our relationship buried in shady secrets. We talked quietly for several minutes, agreeing that whatever we were starting had to be handled with maturity and care. Then Vivien dropped a piece of news I hadn't anticipated. There's an internal leadership transfer opening up next month, she said. Different department, completely separate reporting line. I looked at her in surprise. You were already looking at it? Long before last night, she admitted, a knowing smile touching her lips. This morning just gave me one more reason to stop hiding from what I wanted. A wave of pure relief washed over me. This wasn't some knee-jerk reaction to an emotional night. It was a path she'd already mapped out. We looked at each other and smiled. Then let's do this properly, I said. She nodded without a second's hesitation. Properly. No secrets, no sneaking around, and a real first date, without client emergencies, without crisis calls, and ideally, she added with a smirk, without me passing out on your chest. I grinned. Seems like a reasonable checklist. She looked at me with the brightest expression I had ever seen on her face. Dinner tomorrow. Tomorrow? Why wait? She teased playfully. We've already wasted enough time pretending. I couldn't argue with that logic. Tomorrow it is. She reached for the doorknob, paused one last time, and turned back with a warmth that completely eclipsed her usual professional veneer. Thank you, Owen. Not just for the couch. Thank you for making me feel safe. Those words meant more than any poetry ever could. I stepped in close and gave her a final, honest answer. You never have to play tough around me, Vivien. Whenever the world gets too loud, my door is always unlocked for you. Her eyes softened with emotion. Without another word, she leaned in for one last light kiss, then slipped out into the crisp Chicago morning. Our first official date the following evening felt entirely surreal. There were no looming deadlines, no frantic text pings, no hidden agendas. We tucked ourselves into a corner booth at a quiet little Italian spot in Lincoln Park, worlds away from the downtown noise. Vivien wore a simple black dress instead of her signature power suits, and seeing her stripped of all that corporate weight made me realize how much of herself she usually had to leave at the office door. We talked for hours, not about brand architecture or client metrics, but about our childhoods, our worst habits, the moments we'd secretly caught each other's eye at work, and how obvious it should have been to both of us that this thing hadn't started overnight. It had been quietly taking root for months while we both stubbornly looked the other way. 2 weeks later, Vivien officially filed her internal transfer request, the one she'd been eyeing long before that unforgettable night. A month after that, leadership approved the shift, placing her in a completely separate division with zero structural overlap. The professional wall that had guarded our boundaries from day one vanished, leaving us space to build something real without guilt, shadows, or compromise. Looking back, I think that's why it all worked out. We didn't throw caution to the wind just because we fell for each other. We respected reality. We chose patience over impulse, honesty over convenience, and trust over fleeting thrills. Our feelings had existed long before we confessed them, but the foundation mattered more than the spark. Vivien is still one of the sharpest, most brilliant minds I've ever encountered. She still commands a boardroom with effortless grace, solves impossible client crises before anyone else even registers the smoke, and carries herself with the exact same quiet authority that first drew me in. But now I get the privilege of knowing the rest of her story. She's the woman who occasionally shows up at my door after a brutal 12-hour day carrying takeout instead of a briefcase, kicks off her heels the second she crosses the threshold, steals one of my oversized teas, curls up beside me on that same battered blue couch, and falls asleep without a single care about how the world perceives her. Looking back, I realized that night didn't change our trajectory because we shared a kiss. It changed everything because trust came first. Long before either of us admitted how we felt, we had already proven we could protect each other when the walls came down. The kiss was just the punctuation mark on a sentence our actions had been writing all along. People always romanticize love as starting with grand, cinematic gestures, but ours didn't. It started on a freezing Chicago sidewalk when Vivien looked into my eyes and asked if she could finally let her guard down. Everything that came after grew naturally out of the answer I gave her. And every time she falls asleep beside me now with that absolute peace settling over her face, I know that choosing to protect her heart before trying to win it was the finest decision I ever made.